One, I'm going to first characterize why exactly the US has chosen Okinawa as a particular place, right? Note that Okinawa holds a very strategic position in the entire Asian continent as a whole, right? Number one, it's very close to the South China Sea, meaning a lot of the disputes about the South China Sea and the territory surrounding it are easy to be taken care of just because of the strategic positioning of it, right? But also number two, the fact that it's already it holds a very central position in Asia as a whole, meaning it's very near Korea, it's very near North Korea, and all of these places in Asia, in and of itself, right? Meaning that it's one that holds a lot of power, and the second US, and the point at which US can actually be able to consolidate its position in these places means that it's already taken care of in terms of the military position, right? But also then number two, in terms of your ability as a country to be able to strengthen your military position, right? Note that when if I as a country were to intrude on another country's place and be able to increase or consolidate my military presence there, that already sends a message to all the other surrounding nations in the particular continent, right? Which already proves and already just strengthens my name as a military power or whatever, right? But also then panel in terms of the problems that this then arises for this entire thing, right? Basically all we need to do is prove to you why the alternative is just worse on that side of the house. But also then panel in terms of the actual basis, right? No, we already characterized basis in terms of one, basically it's an extension or an expansion of the actual country in of itself, right? Meaning on that side of the house, they have to prove why having bases in your particular country from another country's from another country is one that's very bad in the magnitude in which this debate is taking place, right? Two problems with this entire thing. Number one panel, the fact that US has more power than Japan, right? With the economy of the US being that much bigger, note that also it's concentrated 75% of its military in this particular small space, right? Meaning that the US has very likely a high say as to how things are supposed to be run economically, right? But also the number two panel in terms of the culture clash of this entire thing, right? Note that when the US has sheer numbers, just because they win in terms of sheer number over the Okinawans or whatever, in this particular in Okinawa as a whole, right? Means that they obviously don't have any incentive to actually fit into the cultural standards of Okinawa and Japan, right? Things like, for example, the non-hedonistic lifestyle or the shit like that in Japan, right? They had no incentive to actually fit into this panel because they already win in terms of sheer number. What incentive do I have to fit into a culture when I'm already a majority of that culture, right? This doesn't make any sense, and I'll prove to you why it's something that's very harmful for both Okinawans and the US alike later on. Also that panel, onto my first argument on why this is bad against the US as a whole, right? Well, two main framing to this, two main things to this. Number one, the fact that there's only 25% now, there's only left to protect the rest of the United States. You know this is so important panel because the US is so much bigger than Japan. Japan, you could probably fit Japan in California. That's how big US is as a whole, right? Couple that panel with the fact that the US already has a lot of other enemies that they have to face with, right? And also panel, thirdly, the fact that the US is already seen as the front of the Western world. But when people think about the Western world and Western values as a whole, they immediately think of the US just because of how mainstream that narrative has been pushed onto them, right? Meaning that terrorists all around the world or whatever who actually want to oppose these Western values or whatever are just that much more likely to actually go and commit the terrorism acts or whatever against the US just because of how it's seen as the front of the Western world, right? Meaning we've already told you panel why the US is one is very likely and the US is very targeted among these individuals, right? But also then how does this bleed into the actual people that matter? Know that the citizens are the ones that are going to be unprotected panel. The citizens are the ones that are most vulnerable. It's not Donald Trump or anyone else in office or whatever. It's the citizens that don't have the actual military to be able to protect themselves panel, and that's why they matter because they're just the most unsupported, they're the most vulnerable in this entire in the entire context of the US, right? But also then panel in terms of the military, know that the men who actually fight in these militaries in the US point of view, they already don't have a say as to whether they're stationed in this particular Okinawa place or whatever, right? And considering that there are already many military bases there, they're already separated from their families, they're already separated from everything that they've ever known, and now you put them into this other foreign land where they're basically forced to go against their will. Basically already proved to you why they don't have any autonomy in terms of this entire thing, which is already obviously very harmful to them. Also then panel, second argument in terms of why this negatively affects Japan. Few pieces of analysis to this. Number one, in terms of the space. Sub-layers to this. Number one, the factories panel. The fact that Japan is already a developed nation, or they really need to drive that growth as the Asian tiger, whatever that it was once hailed as, right? Means that you need a lot of factories in this place. We already tell you already that Japan is already very a powerhouse in terms of semiconductors and stuff like that, right? Which means they need the huge amounts of space to be able to build and push forward their economy via this entire means of semiconductors and manufacturing and things like this, right? Which means panel, we already tell you there's no space for them to be able to do this. If the space in Okinawa is has already been taken up by these factories. You couple and compound that panel by the fact that Japan's already a very, very small country by itself already. Really tell you why land prices are just going to be through the roof. There's no incentive then, or there's no capability for people, for Japanese or like native Okinawans to be able to like actually start their own businesses and things like this, right? Because the land price is obviously going to go through the roof. Also, then panel in terms of farmland. Note that the poorest of the poor in Okinawa in of itself, the only way that they're able to actually get money is by farming, is by agriculture, right? Things like this require a lot of land to be even begin with, and the fact that you're not even able to do this panel is already something very bad because you just cannot afford the land, right? We already tell you why this affects the most vulnerable people in Okinawa in of itself. Second thing to this panel in terms of the citizens, in terms of why the citizens would actually want to oppose this in the first place, right? And why Japan should actually listen to them. Number one, you have a lot of pollution, right? These military bases produce a lot of ammo shells, produce a lot of like toxic waste, and a lot of smoke to begin with, right? You have to be able to run these things continuously, right? Electricity that you have to get from like, I don't know, some random ass energy source. It's probably going to be very, very like taxing in terms of your environment and the pollution, right? I'll take you later, which already proves why the citizens don't want that. You couple that panel also by the fact that it's already a culture clash, which you already have explained, right? The fact that the US that now can they can do whatever they want, and they can basically like be a bit of an asshole because the fact that there's no incentive for them to be able to fit into your culture already proves you why Okinawans are against this. Even if you don't buy that panel, already tell you as a country, as Japan, already have an obligation to listen to your citizens of Japan, of Okinawa, who have protested to you. The fact that they have already protested to you so many times already proves the fact that that this is something that they do not want in their country, and you had an obligation to listen to them. Third point, then in terms of resources, right? Note that Japan is already not at war. Japan doesn't have any more enemies like they used to, like in World War I or World War II or whatever, right? Which already proves to you there's no real necessity for this entire like policy of like US having the bases that even be a thing in the first place, right? Japan doesn't need protection because they don't have as many enemies in the first place in the military context, right? Which means then we already tell you panel that it's not necessary for Japan to even be protected. We already tell you there's a waste of funds, a waste of resources that you will have to put into your upkeep and things like this, right? You have to divert these funds from somewhere, panel, and you can take away all of this from the actual infrastructure that you're able to produce and give out to these Okinawans and things like this in the first place, right? On your side of the house, you have to prove why that is worth it. But also then, panel, in terms of colonization, note that when the US has military bases here, obviously, even if they would explicitly say, okay, we will not harm you Japanese people or whatever, it's already implied. You see soldiers carrying guns around your neighborhood, obviously you're going to feel some sort of guilt, or not guilt, but some sort of fear whenever you see them, right? Which is obviously going to hinder your ability to be able to actually be to be able to do your things, right? Meaning you just have very, very bad life on your side of the house. Very proud to propose.
So the government has already pointed out a world where there is no military base in Okinawa because it does more harm than good. While doing so, they have actually painted a world where there is no protection from the US. Because remember, the motion that we have today is regarding the US-Japan Security Alliance. So if there is no backing from Okinawa, if there is no military base in Okinawa, what resources do Japan have in regards to security? Before I start my arguments, I would just like to rebut a few points made by the opposition, as apologies made by the government, where firstly, they did acknowledge that Okinawa do have a strategic location because it's close to the South China Sea, it's easy to take care of, it's near the North Korea countries, and as such, Okinawa is a strategic location, and that is why the US chose to put this base in Okinawa. However, they claim that there is more harm than good. Firstly, they cited that US has more power over Japan, where it will turn into a place where there is a colonization happening. So if there is colonization, but the government has actually failed to prove why colonization would exist in this situation. From our standing is that there is no colonization because in the event that when the US soldiers do go to Japan, they have to follow the rules set by the Japanese government. They cannot just do whatever they want. And in regards to culture, it's the same thing. Culture, in other words, is actually just a way for a country to set their laws, right? So when countries are setting their laws, they see the culture of the country, they see the culture of the people, and they set their laws based on the culture to suit the citizens' needs. As such, the law is already imposed where the US has to follow them. Okay, next. The government also mentioned about if 75% of military soldiers were to be relocated to the Okinawa base, what is left for US? US will be left with 25% to be protected with. However, let me ask you, how many wars have been going on in US itself. If you see the war that US is going on is always in Afghanistan, Iran and places like this. What war is in US right now? And that is why allocating 25% of the soldiers to stay in US is actually a strategic move on the US, because as the government has mentioned, Okinawa is a strategic location. So if North Korea, for example, if North Korea were to attack the US, they have the strategic location in Okinawa. For example, they mentioned South China Sea. They have that strategic location, which gives them an advance in strategic planning. Now, moving on, the government side has also mentioned about the military personnel have nowhere to be stationed according to what the government says, and they will not be living in where they are originally from. So, for example, a family from, let's say, California. A family from California, the father is stationed somewhere else, for example, Okinawa, then they will not be reunited with the family. Isn't that the case for current military personnel already? So what is the difference between being relocated and fighting in a war in Afghanistan than being relocated to a place where it's like Okinawa with a military base? This is a few examples and few arguments that the government did not prioritize on and did not further explain. Now, the government also mentions about farming and agriculture, bringing up pollution and stuff. Now, I would like to contest this by talking about the best case and worst case scenarios of both parties. On the government side, their best case scenario is that there is a reduce in protests and a reduce in pollution. While their worst case scenario is that war will be happening. There will be no US backing, because like we mentioned that the motion here today is a US-Japan security alliance. So what this means is that US gives security or gives military personnel to Japan, while Japan provides them with a base. If there is no base to be provided, then there is no backing from the US. Now, that will mean it will lead to war, it will lead to land destruction, it will lead to a decrease in economy. Moving on, from our point of view, from the opposition, would be the best case scenario is that we actually do provide, there's no war going on. US will help Japan in regards to being threatened, in regards to any threats they have received, which in turn boosts up job opportunities, security and economic benefits, which will be explained further on. Meanwhile, our worst case scenario is that there will be a mass protest of civilians in Japan. Now I bring to you this. Wouldn't it be feasible for the Japanese government to prioritize the security of the people compared to wouldn't it be better for the Japanese government to prioritize the security people? Because the security outweighs mass protests. That should be in line with the Japanese government's understanding. Now, I would like to put only one argument in my speech, which is that the main reason for this alliance, a main reason why US and Japan has this alliance is because of security. Okay. So, with US security or with US military personnel in Japan, we are actually ensuring that there are no threats coming into Japan. Where, for example, we can see North Korea, which poses a threat, China, which has precedence of posing a threat. So when they see that the US actually has, that the Japanese government has the backing of the United States, they would feel less inclined to, initiate a war where there is little chance of winning. As such, I reiterate that security is the main reason why the opposition is on the stance that this security alliance is actually doing more good than harm and not more harm than good. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, government is debating in a world full of assumptions. Number one, they keep on saying that US is the bad villain, who's the bigger villain and whatnot. They are living in a world full of assumptions. Why? Number one, they fail to understand that this is a security agreement and that there are things that need to be considered, right? Number one, the entire motion of this debate is filled to be proven by Team Government because they fail to establish certain ground principles that for us needs to be established to debate on. First of all, we need to come back to the motion, which is this House believes that US military base in Okinawa has done more harm than good. Team Government has come to us and provided a few examples and few statements by their hand. Okay, more harm as defined by government. Number one is Japan not enough space, so they can't do proper colonization. They can't even do proper industrial revolution. They have not enough space to build companies and whatnot, which is totally unreliable. Why? Because number one, if 0.6% is a huge case scenario of building more companies, what happened to the other percentage of in the 100%? Which does not make any sense at all. Because 0.6, you are debating there's not enough space. So you're telling me that Japan has not enough space at all. That 0.6 is the entire debate of the topic. Crazy. Number two is that there is no say. Japan will not have any say if US has their military base there. Now, why I say this is totally irrelevant and stupid from government is because in an agreement, it's clearly stipulated that if I were to be in a US or Japan agreement, especially in a security alliance, number one is that, okay, for example, US, you only have certain jurisdiction which is clearly defined in an agreement. So, which falls down to the basic agreement. You definitely will outline, as Japan would outline, okay, this is the things that you can do, this is the things that you cannot do. US will definitely have to agree to it, which will become binding, the basic principles of an agreement. And you think government has failed to even understand that basic principle. And if they cannot debate on that basic principle, they can go on to define that who is the bigger villain. That does not relate back to our question. The question is basically stating that whether having a military base from US has done more harm than good. Alright. To further elaborate how team opposition stance is much more relatable to team government is because number one, as stated by team government's prime minister, a strategic place, South China Sea and near countries like South Korea power is to display more one's military power, which does not make any sense at all. Number one, yes, even if their best case scenario is to show one's military power, yes, it may be. But in that agreement, it is only to protect Japan's facilities or even economic development. Okay, right? Number two, as stated by team government's prime minister, is that US will overshadow Japan as they, number one, US is very targeted easily for target terrorism. This does not relate to the question. The question is basically regarding more harm than good if the US has their base in Okinawa. If they have terrorism back in US, that is US problem. The topic is about US and Japan. So how does this benefit US and Japan? If terrorism is happening in the US, it is US problem if they want to have even 100% of their military base power in Japan, right? That is failed to even, they even fail to even understand that basic concept of a military base. They go on saying that they'll be supported by family, the soldiers will have no autonomy, and they need space to build more companies and better taking companies than military. Right. That does not even relate to the question because you see, soldiers are basically, before they even enter into the working environment, they will be like, yes, I am signing up, I know what I'm going to sign up for, I know I will die even 1 minute in a manner, even killing my own self in the process, or maybe die with a drone, or anything it may be. They know that they have very limited autonomy, and even if they have very limited autonomy, they actually have the basic principles of rights, which is going back to home at least once a year, which I think they fail to even understand that part. Okay, now, the next point will be stated by team government's point is basically pollution, which shows toxic waste and they can do whatever they want. Alright, toxic waste. They fail to notify actually what kind of toxic waste are they providing. Okay, if toxic waste, what kind of toxic waste? Where are they going to dump the toxic waste? They have failed to actually even elaborate on that part. And also to update Judge that actually this situation has already been curbed by Japan right now, where they, as stated in the info slide, they are building new bases, is because of this issue as well. Because they would want to strengthen their economic development part. So they're actually relocating the entire base to another place just because of their entire pollution. So if you can see, Japan actually focuses more on their economic development and not even on the security part. Which brings us back to my team stance, which is number one, if we were to have US military base in Okinawa, it actually does not do more harm than good. Why? Because number one, if the US base is in military, actually countries alongside Japan would definitely be more fearful to even attack Japan in the first place. For example, a powerhouse as stated by them, China and South Korea. They'll be definitely thinking twice, oh shit, Japan is literally having US military base, 75%, whatnot. They'll be definitely thinking twice, do I have the capabilities to do that? Which then in returns provides the economic development potential for Japan to actually improve on the economy, which goes against their very own stance. Because if we in the House will believe that US military base is focused on Japan, they actually have more potential and even more security on them to actually build more companies more, they do not need to fear like, oh shit, so Korea is going to bomb me anytime. Or as stated by then, China controlling the South China Sea. It does not make any sense. And has already been clarified by my Prime Minister. Yes, anything.
If they're taking up this much land space in a specific area, how am I supposed to economically develop that area itself?
Exactly, a dumb argument as it stands. 0.6% as an entire development area, think twice. That means you can go check. The entire debate is basically on how does ultimately base does more harm than good, right? Your debate on 0.6% does not make sense because if 0.6%, if you notice properly, it's an island. It's literally near a site. 0.6%, they do not believe any economical development over there. Japan basically entire economic development in their countries. Please go check your facts. So if you really need to go check on that, 0.6% does not make any sense again. Because 0.6%, okay, what happened to the others? You fail to even recognize what happened to the other 0.6%. So it's not a problem actually if you were to provide 0.6% to the US government, because number one, they are actually defending Japan from outer external external threats, right? Like countries as mentioned by them, China, South Korea, and etc. So if they are defended by the US military base, they are most probably likely to actually improve in the economic development, which now actually Japan is actually facing a lot of huge downfall in the economic development. So this would actually, by the presence of US military base in Okinawa, would actually provide them more good. And in regards to the people actually protesting about that part, yes, there will be protests. I agree that US somehow will, as quote by then, colonize the entire place, which does not make sense again, because an entire base, they need to understand that military base is only for a certain development part, right? So to sum up, what I'm trying to say is that number one, there is no colonization that will happen in team government's proposition, and number two, opposition has actually proven that by having a US military base in Okinawa has actually done more good than harm. Thank you.
Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. They cannot just say, aha, we have the most strongest military despite whatever harms it did to our local community, and suddenly we have the best benefit ever. First thing that I'm going to do is simple call out. In order for OP to win this debate, they need to prove two things. First, how does it benefit US? Note that there's no analysis coming from their speech on how this actually benefit US to begin with. They say this is to protect Japan, even if it's even that, right? But then they never actually prove to us on how it benefits US to begin with. Number two, what danger is Japan facing? They cannot just assert and say, oh, there's potential danger. If that's the case, then the whole fucking country in the whole world needs US military, right? Insofar this doesn't make sense. They need to prove what's the imminent danger that Japan is facing right now. Absent in this analysis, then they cannot necessarily take this debate. But also number two, they also haven't proven to us the justification on the base expansion that currently happening on Okinawa. In order for them, even if they are able to do this, they then need to prove the prerequisite analysis, and that is that Japan's in danger, like continuously like growing, right? But second, again, this alliance, it benefits US because it's related to China, therefore US wants it. It's not really whether or not US is able to protect Japan. I'm pretty sure Japan is fine on its own. But second thing I'm going to do is and thirdly, right, they also haven't explained to us who would attack Japan to begin with. I think Japan has such a huge influence, such an important country, especially in trade of technology, especially in leading like green technology or whatsoever. So I'm unsure in what country out there would dare to attack Japan to begin with, considering a shit ton of alliance that Japan has, even if they don't necessarily have exclusive military base in Okinawa. The second part of my speech, I'm going to deal with the best case scenario. Even if we're debating the framing of that, oh, this is to protect Japan. First, Christian tells you the over-reliance of this military is harmful, because at point of which there's an imminent danger or whatsoever, US can just like back out, and therefore Japan is vulnerable. Note that this is not something that they have engaged yet. But also number two, you can also protect Japan in other ways, right? You can trade in tech, you can trade in military practices. All of this is to boost Japan's military power to begin with. If the aim is really to protect Japan, then they need to have a better alternative that doesn't harm the local community to begin with. But number three, if the idea is to protect Japan, then why are you in a fucking island? Protect the actual place, the core economy of the countries to begin with. I'm unsure that how you're able to protect Japan if you're only in this one particular area. Doesn't make sense at all. Two things I'm going to talk about in my clash. The first, how does this harm Okinawa? And then number two, how does this harm US then? On the first clash, how does this harm Okinawa, right? We proved to you two things. First, it harms the environment in itself. Because military bases most often means that you have to cut down trees, most often that you have to destroy the soil or whatsoever, right? Because you need to build a lot of infrastructures or whatsoever. They say, oh, Japan has rules, US won't listen, US will abide to that. Sure, that's what US is known for, right? 3 responses here then. First, note that the idea of neo-colonization can happen in a lot of ways. At point of which you have a lot of white men wearing guns and tanks, military outfit roaming around your local community is at point of which you are afraid to speak out. This means that it's most likely the idea of fear alone is enough to counter the protest of the local community. This is also something that they haven't engaged yet. Why the idea of local people over there, even if it's only 0.6, why the lives of these people does not matter or whatsoever. But also number 2, the idea of clashes in culture, right? The fact that Western culture is just so contradictory to Asian culture in itself already explains the dissatisfaction of local community. But 3, rules are breakable, right? Because if it's true that they are able to listen to whatever Japan's rule is, then there wouldn't be local protesters to begin with, or number 2, Japan would listen to the local protesters. Because the reality is, even if US were to beat the shit out of the local people, there's no incentive for Japan then to scold US, because per their framing, Japan relies on US. Therefore, US have a huge amount of power over Japan to begin with. But number 2, they haven't engaged with any of the local problems we proved to you. On the idea of local economy, right? It's very important for you to have your local farmers engaging with your local people to begin with. It creates a safety environment, not only for your old people, but also for your young children to grow up. It harms the environment in itself, your plantation, whatever farms that exist within this small community. The fact that it's small community to begin with already explains to you to some extent that they rely on each other. At point of which you allow white people to enter this local community is at point of which will harm people. But also number 2, the idea of expansion of base. This is particularly harmful. If US only send small group of people over there, it's fine. At point of which it's 75% of the military US and increasing, is at point of which we can see that new colonization is something that can happen. Even if it doesn't happen to Japan entirely, it happens to this local community. You push people away. They need to prove why it's okay for you to lock out these people from their own place to begin with. Is something that shouldn't be considered in this debate. Before I move on to my second clash, awesome. The second clash of this debate is, how does this harm US to begin with? This is also unresponded. They say, oh, whatever happened in US, happened in US, doesn't matter. No, you also have to prove how it benefits US to begin with. This is the biggest gap in their speech to begin with, right? Few responses here. 1, any war that doesn't benefit the US people, we are also against that. This means if US wants to enter Afghanistan, we also say fuck that, right? But specifically in Okinawa, I'm unsure because they haven't proved to us how it benefits the people in the US as well. This means then, if it doesn't benefit the US, then what's the point of Trump sending this 75% in Okinawa to begin with? But also number 2, even if it's not in terms of sending out people, know that you have to fund a lot. The expansion of base means you fund tanks, you fund jets, you fund guns, you fund a lot of military practices to begin with. You take money from the local taxpayers. This means a lot of people don't necessarily have the autonomy of where the money go to, right? This also pushes back what Irons want to talk about, right? The idea of the reason why these people volunteered to begin with is to help your country, is to represent US to begin with. If you're representing US in Okinawa, without the explanation as to how it benefits US to begin with, this already takes away their autonomy or their consent as to why they're in the US, as to why they joined the military to begin with, right? As long as we prove to you that in so far, 1, it harms the local community, but also number 2, it harms the US itself, we think that we already take this debate. But what's the better alternative then, right? If it's, again, being charitable here, even if this debate is about protecting Japan, you can do that by number 1, having US to sponsor your military tanks, so sponsor your military practices, military strategy, or whatsoever to improve Japan's military to begin with. At point of which you only rely on US and you want US to increase more and more in this one specific 0.6 island, is at point of which you want Japan to fail. Referring back to the framing on our side of the house, right? We think that insofar, even if sure, at first maybe this can be seen as a good idea, but at point of which the expansion increases, you ignore your local community, is at point of which we say that the US and the Okinawa people already lost the plot. Government.
Thank you, Prophet. We want to open.
Ladies and gentlemen, I didn't expect today I'll be teaching history classes to my opposition side. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the US and Japan Alliance Agreement? The word alliance, please check in Disney. What does the word alliance means? Alliance is where Japan and US both mutually consent and agree to which US will come to Okinawa to stay. I need to you all read the info slide carefully as well. Japan has agreed
has agreed to let US come to Okinawa. That's the first thing you have to clarify first. US are not coming here just simply to say, oh what, you know what, I have a bigger base, I'm coming here, you listen to me. That's not only that. Secondly, I think you all read the whole agreement as well. They also have an agreement between military personnel in US and Japan. They both have already signed an agreement between the military personnel conducts. Let's say, if US goes against certain rules and regulations that has been set, yes, they'll be kicked out from Japan. I think you all can go and read the rules and regulations one more time. Moving on. We also have the side, now moving on, we're comparing both sides, our world and their world. Moving on, the whole motion today is about US based in Okinawa, the 0.6%. We dare to say the 0.6%, yes, there will be people suffering from that, but we are seeing on the bigger picture of the other people who realize security from US. Why is this so? The reason why this agreement came into place in the first place is because Japan was scared to be threatened by North Korea and also China. I know you can say, oh, Japan is the biggest economy. Let's say I come tomorrow and say, hey boy, I'm going to beat you up tomorrow. Don't tell me suddenly one day you learn martial arts, you know Muay Thai, you know Kung Fu. No, Japan also needs time to develop their own armies. So once they have already been mixing with US, they need time. In that time, let us say North Korea and let us say China attacks. What is Japan going to do? As mentioned by you all, Japan does not develop the armies that good yet. Hence why they have already agreed with US for them to come here to help us to be secured from all these attacks. That is one thing they have to know about this agreement between US and also Japan. Moving on. Now I'm going to give you the rebuttals from team opposition to team government. Number one, the consensus. Ladies and gentlemen, if even me and you here know, once you join army, you're not going to be specific in one position. You are telling me that the army doesn't know that when they are applying? You have to understand that when armies are applying, they know that they are not going to be based only in America. They're going to be scattered throughout all the world. This is basic common sense and general knowledge. All army people know this. That okay, hey, when I'm applying, I'm here. You are just focusing on the word protect. You're also saying the word of serve. Serve and protect. Two things come together. And yes, once you join into army, you know that you're not going to be specifically be in America. You're going to be throughout all the countries where you have army bases in. Moving on. Yes. Okay. Okay. Economy base. 0.6% economy promote local business. Since you want to focus on the 0.6%, as mentioned by you all, Japan is one of the most best economic country in the world, right? So you all are focusing on the 0.6% rather than the other percentage of Japan. You're telling me Japan so big country, you all just want to focus on the 0.6% because hey, local businesses. Yes, exactly.
Do you think US taxpayers support this?
Sorry, come again?
Do you think US taxpayers support this?
US taxpayers support this? Good question. I don't think we need to know whether US taxpayers agrees to this or not. Because at the end of the day, the governments are doing a decision, and Japan people, I agree, there is protest. There is protest. Do not disagree with the fact that there is protest from Japanese, but there's also people who agree to this bases being built in Okinawa. So why are you going to say to that people? Are you going to have another protest by saying, oh no, people agree, so we have to say that we have to build base? No, there is always two sides of the coin, and we are saying that our side of the coin is more important because we are protecting Japan in a whole. Well, you are just focusing on the 0.6% of the people in Japan instead of the whole Japan, which makes it totally absurd. Moving on. We are now like to go on to the best case scenario and worst case scenario from team government and team opposition. Best case scenario, 1. We foster more mutual ties and alliance with Japan. Number 2. We provide jobs to the people in Japanese. I say you all can go home and read also about this agreement. That we also provide jobs to the people in Japan to come and work there, and they're being paid for it as well. Not only that, once the US militaries are there, they are using Japanese products, hence increase the economy of Japan as well. Take in mind of that. Third, we also provide security to the whole country of Japan instead of you all focus on the 0.6%. So, what is our worst case scenario? 1. Focusing on the 0.6% of the local business being dropped. Number 2, US being targeted by other countries. Funny. Third, lack of economic resources. As mentioned by your own team government, Japan is the biggest economical country in the world, and the 0.6% might reduce 50% of your economy. I don't think so, right? Then the second one is US being targeted. Let's be real. How many cases can you name me now US are being targeted? You can't name anything. Why? Because they're scared to attack US. You know, 75% of US military base are in Japan. They are still one of the most efficient and the most equipped army in the world. You know, there's only 25% left in America. No countries dare to attack America until now. Why? Because the army resource that they have, hence with them sending the armies all over to Japan, which doesn't make any conscience to them because they have the facilities to provide and protect their own citizens for being attacked by these other threats. Now, let me summarize the whole debate in the scope. Team opposition has came up, the team government has come up and said that number one, we care about the 0.6%. We care about the 0.6% because they have no place to resource. These local businesses are very, very sad. Instead of thinking about the bigger picture, like think about a small picture instead of a bigger picture, but we are thinking about the bigger picture. Next, they don't even know about what is the whole agreement context in the whole, where it's a mutual consent by both countries, not just by America. You can't just simply come up here and say, hey look, America is a bigger country. Then Japan will be like, yes, I will listen to you whatever you say. That is not the whole debate. The whole debate is about both countries having consent and agree to this agreement. With that being said, I'll now be prodded to the host.
I'm standing here before you for the last time to reiterate what this entire debate has been about. As mentioned by myself and my opposition speakers, the government has actually misunderstood the motion at hand, where they are more focused on a one-way transaction, where Japan is providing a military base, but what is US providing in return, or the other way around? The speakers on government has stated in both scenarios where only a one-way transaction has occurred. However, in our stance, we are thinking of an alliance, which in this case is the topic at hand, whereby it is a US and Japan security alliance. An alliance is a two-way transaction, as mentioned by the opposition whip. It's a two-way transaction. So what is this transaction? Let me reiterate it again. So for Japan, they are providing a military base, and this military base is not for soldiers to just sit there and wait for a potential war that might come to Japan. It acts as a base between other countries where Japan is the middleman, where Okinawa, this base in Okinawa, is the middleman. So let's say there is a war that is all the way across the world. Now we have a base in the middle between US and the other country. So wouldn't resources be allocated more sufficiently if there is a base in Japan? This is what Japan provides to the US. Now let's talk about what US provides to Japan, because this is an alliance, like I have mentioned many times again. US has actually provided security, because like we have mentioned and that we have established in the opposition side, US-Japan security alliance is dependent on the fact that there is a potential threat from North Korea and China. And due to this potential threat, and as Japan does not have a strong military personnel, is why we need this support from the US. And as government has mentioned before this, US is providing security, right? But then there is technically, so does this mean? That means that the Japan military is not actually being developed. I would not say that is the case, because US in this scenario actually acts as a fallback plan. In the event that the military of North Korea and China really do come in and then starts attacking Japan, and Japan do not have the correct resources, US acts as that fallback plan. This is how an alliance is formed. Now, I would like to reiterate again what is the best case and what is the worst case scenario of this entire topic, because that is how we actually decide which situation is better. Now, let me just talk about the worst case scenario from our end. For the worst case scenario, we have mass protests. We have a minority of 0.6% compared to the other 99.4%. So is government trying to say, if we were to not have this military base and do not have the US support, are they trying to say that yes, they do agree to an alliance as there is less harm than good? Are they saying that the potential threat to that 99.4% is doing less harm than good is doing more harm than good compared to just harming 0.6%? And that is why we stand that this House believes, and that is why we stand in the opposition side saying that US military bases does not do more harm than good. Thank you.
Thank you. Gov reply.
Very simple structure, the call, general feedback, and then the overlay. So the call, I gave this debate to side government, albeit it was actually pretty close and contentious. I think it just comes down to things like how certain issues in the round were weighed. Okay, general feedback. I have a lot of problems with this round. I'm going to keep this short, but I highly encourage teams to come to me and understand the full gravity of the mistakes that were made in this round. The first biggest problem in this debate is that there are a shit ton of assertions that are made. There are more assertions in this debate made than there are actually proven claims. Because I think there's a few reasons as to why this happened. And this occurs on both sides, by the way. Both debaters are equally guilty. Both teams are equally guilty of this. The first problem is that the presumption of things like basic facts from the info slide is used as a methodology to prove your argument. The problem is that that's prescribing a thing to prove an argument. It doesn't actually prove the argument. So for example, just because you say an agreement is an agreement, because the definition of an agreement is mutual, it doesn't actually lead to the conclusion that they are nice to each other. You're just using like a dictionary definition to prove a point. But the same thing occurs the other way, right? Like, of course, maybe there's not an active threat. But just because there's an active threat doesn't mean that security is not valuable. The prescription of what is presumed to be a lack of active threat does not meet the automatic conclusion of why is it that deterrence doesn't happen. So my point here is that be very cautious on the arguments you make and the degree of which you actually prove them. I will be very specific on the things I found assertive and the things I didn't find assertive, but this is just a general reminder, I think. The second thing, and I think this is something that really kind of did not, I wouldn't say made the debate bad, but kind of stopped the debate from being what I would think to be reasonably above average. I'm very confused why no one uses current context in this round. Also the fact that there are some wrong contexts. On current context, no one brings up Trump and the context of the current US state and its current, push to be a slight bit isolationist. The tariffs that are happening and how this affects global foreign policy. Because presumably the reason this motion was set by CAP is because a huge amount of current affairs makes this motion very relevant. Things like, let me just, a bunch of stuff that I've read that the average reasonable voter should know. Things like China increasing its military exercises over the South China Sea. But also, this debate also ignores a bit of historical context. And this is like a big problem I have with the Gov bench, where it's like, Japan doesn't need active threat. But like, you can't just ignore North Korea and China. I'm sorry, I get the point of the argument, which is that, well, they're not doing anything right now. Firstly, that's not entirely false, but that's not entirely true either. And there are also a lot of nuances here, right? Like the fact that North Korea does missile tests above Japan, the fact that Japan does not have its own military right now, that's true, I guess. But my point here, and also the historical context of this, this is an agreement made after World War II, to some extent after they took down the shogunate. Okay, I'm getting into a lot of the details here. You can ask me later on how you would argue this. The point I'm trying to make here is that there's not enough use of nuance that exists in the status quo to prove your arguments. And also there's a misapplication of basic facts to prove things which are not entirely correct, but sound true because they exist in the context of what we like to call debater land, where when you debate in debater land, a lot of things that seem idealistic are proven to be true because you're using basic logic like kumbaya or stress without necessarily being ascribed to what is realistic within the round. Okay, so on the OA, first on Okinawa and the citizens. I think this is where Gov kind of have what I describe to be the clear win in this clash, because they explain a bunch of stuff like harms towards the Okinawan context, things like harming the environment, like harming the local capacity of the economy, and the idea of neo-colonialism. So there is a few problems though with the way they argue this. The first is that I agree that an opportunity cost exists for Okinawa. The problem I have here is that the frame of reference to why this is more harm than good, aside from just a harm, is that, well, they are taking this to the next level and they're going far and the protests are existing. The issue is that government doesn't actually characterize so much on what the US has done here to prove a prevailing link of why there is more existing harm. Because I think what Gov opposition points out here is that even if there are some protests and some resistance here, I think the presence of the United States has brought about some things that are possibly good for Okinawa. I agree that opposition doesn't really build this up themselves, i.e. there's not an attempt to characterize or explain how the process of military bases has been good for the local Okinawan citizens, but it is somewhat fair to point out that these military bases have some semblance of a purpose, which we'll talk about later. There are also some asserted harms that don't get built up. Firstly, the cultural clash harm on Gov. This does not get mechanized. It doesn't. I don't see anything why I would credit this. It's just asserted that because Japan and US have different culture, they're not going to like each other. And the mechanism for this is that there are protests. But again, why the protests probably happen for other reasons. So I'm not sure where the link there existing. The other problem here is, and I think this is where Gov opposition correctly point out, is yes, there is harm, but the alternative is that no presence exists, and the lack of presence does not mean that Japan is good on its own. And this is one of the biggest problems I have with Gov, which is that you guys are kind of pretty uncomparative. Because you just say, because the US pulled out, now the Japan can do a bunch of things. But you don't actually mechanize why Japan can do those things by themselves. So Op is actually correct here. They are fair to point out that sure, there's an over-reliance, but the dependency is there to keep Japan, and by extension Okinawa, on its feet. So the lack of an explanation of why US would scoot back off, even if it is true that there is lightning, doesn't necessarily lead to more benefit. So there's no benefit that I can reasonably credit because there's no mechanism to prove why a benefit would accrue when the US backs off. But there are also certain problems with opposition. And I think saw this coming. The response that because this is a mutual alliance, there's control. Again, firstly, the problem is that even if an agreement exists, you need to prove why the agreement is mutual to the point where there is no active harm done on Japan. The problem is that you get close by saying that because it's a mutual agreement, i.e. there are certain trade-offs that we're willing to take, this doesn't actually prove why there is no active harm. It just says that maybe they want to control themselves, but you just assert they will control themselves. So Gov is correct to point out here that because of the over-reliance that Japan has on the United States, the power dynamic still exists. So Op doesn't meaningfully explain to me why is it that United States would hold themselves back and things like that. The other responses, things like 0.6% is not the tipping point. I agree that this means that Japan does not get meaningfully harmed as an economy. But I think the point of Gov is not that Japan's economy gets screwed. It is that Okinawa and the landmass and the people that live within it get screwed. And the issue with this is that opposition doesn't actually respond to. So what I like to say is opposition responds by saying, well, it's 99.4% that isn't benefited, but not responding to the 0.6% of people that are actually harmed. And this is an issue because the Gov Win, and this is where we get onto the wing, is an explanation that Okinawan citizens are very vulnerable. They do not have control, their land is actively taken away, their business is being harmed. I'm not sure why, but you don't respond to this argument aside from saying even if their protest is fine because of security, which we'll talk about later. But this is very dangerous because you're actively letting go of the argument that, sure they protest and they have problems, but to some degree it's fine. The other mitigations from side of opposition also don't work. Things like, there's a claim made that they will relocate. This also asserted, I'm not sure what the point of the response was, but the point I'm trying to make here is that opposition doesn't necessarily respond to the tangible harms that the Gov team explains that happens towards Okinawan citizens. The other point of weighing here is the harm of over-reliance, which I think becomes the tipping point for why there is more harm than good, which is the idea that even if an existing state of US in Okinawa brings about some degree of stability within the region, which is necessary for Japan, the problem is that the harm of Japan using US as too much means that Japan loses a lot more, specifically on the context of not prioritizing the needs and interests of the Okinawan citizen. So at the end of this, I think what is clear is that the Okinawan citizen, who is rated as the most vulnerable actor, does get harmed, and Gov is able to explain to me. Opposition tries to mitigate this by saying that US would want to back off, but they don't meaningfully prove the response, and they don't also meaningfully rebut the claims happen. There are some rebuttals made. The issue is that these rebuttals are asserted. Things like, sorry, things like, clearly they will control themselves and other pieces, but you'd have to explain why US has an incentive to not oppress these people, or why US doesn't have an incentive to do this, aside from just using an agreement that exists. So at the end of this, I think at the end of this, Okinawa, citizens are harmed. Secondly, on security and deterrence. So Gov says there is no current danger. Aside from the fact that this is technically empirically wrong, the issue that I have with opposition is that the legwork you guys do to prove the argument that there is an active threat is not extensively analyzed. The far point that opposition goes here is that North Korea and China exist, and if the United States goes away, that means that China, Japan is under more active threat and things like that. And I think Op has a good point here in terms of explaining to me that active deterrence that the United States presence has means that it is still a relevant point of security. And even if Gov is fair to point out that, well, there is no active threat, I think the point that is proven in opposition is that there is active deterrence, which means that, so it is not saying that something would happen, and it is saying that something that could happen does not happen, things like North Korea and China. And I think this is a valid point that Op makes. I have some problems with Gov here in terms of the way they try to engage with security. The first thing they say is remilitarization, which is a DPM extension. Again, this argument is the correct case for this motion. The issue is that it is not mechanized why remilitarization is possible. So you say that because US back off, now they can remilitarize because they have to depend on themselves. But the op response is they depend on themselves, but they are more vulnerable. What is the resource for them to depend on themselves if their military is weak? Very valid response. I don't think Gov actually proved the comparative of why is it that the security that Japan is able to secure for itself. Then they say US presence is not good security. The issue here is that this is presumed on the characterization that the United States is a selfish actor, and there are some responses that Gov say, which is, well, the United States is a selfish actor, it is a power dynamic. I agree that the power dynamic exists, but I think there's a question of how much disproportionate harm this power dynamic does in the security of Japan. Because the question I had at the end of the round is, presumably even if the US is selfish, the reason they set up the base to secure their own interests is because they want to make sure that the stability of that region, which is also within their own interests. So the upshot of this is that what Op is trying to say here is that the security of Japan is somewhat within the United States' interest, which is why they built the base in the first place, and things like that. Then, so at the end of this, it's slightly unclear on side government why is it that security does not happen, because responses made are slightly uncharitable and need to assume a few internal burdens met. I like the weighing that Gov does use here in terms of the Gov Win speech, which is to say that if there is no active threat, then even if there is an active deterrence that happens, this does not necessarily mean a win condition within the round. And I agree that you should have to care about other things. This leads me to something I need to do very clearly, which is a weighing on the security clash versus the Okinawa clash. So opposition kind of does win the security clash, albeit by a slight margin, insofar as they explain that there is a very realistic, valid reason to avoid certain harms on the stability of the region, and this is still something that's important. Problem, this is not weighed to be the most important metric in the debate. It is just explained that Japan needs the United States to make sure that it is stable and they need to protection. Issue, Gov's weighing here on Okinawan citizens kind of tells me that I need to prioritize that weighing metric over the other weighing metric of security. Because even if it is presumably to be true that the stability of Japan and the entire East Asian region leads to outcomes that lead me to believe that there are more benefits than harms, the problem is that there is no legwork to prove why that is something which is the most important impact in the round. So at the end of this, given the kinds of likelihoods and the kinds of claims I can believe are credited, government has the benefit of proving an active harm done on Okinawan citizens. They weigh this to be the most important because of their fact being vulnerable, and even if the United States exists to save Japan, these sets of people are still in danger. Therefore, I think that is why government is able to explain to me that the state of Okinawa and needing to protect these people matters more than security. But let's say you don't believe the weighing of this, and maybe to some semblance, security is thing. I want to now talk about US interests, because I think this is also becoming a relevant clash in the round. Gov does a lot of work to explain that the United States actively gets harmed from its ability to put 75%. So there's analysis such as, well, there's lots of money that you put into this, people don't consent into this, they are soldiers. Op has some relevant mitigation. First, they say soldiers consent to this. Second, they say it's not really much of a problem. Thirdly, the United States is the largest military force in the world. Deterrence still matters, and this is something that is important, and etc. I think again, the issue with these responses is that they are not completed. Sure, soldiers do consent to where they are going, but I think Gov's active harm is explaining that the kinds of possible security risks that you trade off, because the opportunity cost that they're explaining here is that you prioritize other regions, but now the South region is something that's not protected. I agree that it's very easy to come up with gut check responses to this, such as saying that the United States is the largest military in the world. They have a lot of money. The problem is that those responses are not made to prove to me why is it that the United States is not capable of defending itself. It is alluded to that the United States could still do this or that it's not important, but within debate has to be completed. So how do you weigh this? I think if you don't believe the win condition of the first clash, which is that the Okinawans, this is also another relevant harm. I'm almost done. Oh, okay. I'll submit soon. So let's say you don't believe the main path to victory, which is the idea of do we protect Okinawa versus security. This is a second independent win condition that SideGov has, which is explaining to me that there are also external harms, such as the fact that United States taxpayers are not very happy and they are spending their money, but also the fact that you are trading off a lot of resources for military funding for an unclear benefit. So even if it is true, there is some necessity of security, what opposition has to explain here is why security and the funding towards the security is so necessary that it is willing to trade off things like an uncertain benefit, but also an active harm towards people who are being oppressed. So the bottom line here is, it is true to some degree that macro impacts such as the stability of a region and the need to ensure military powers to avoid conflict is an important impact, but for these impacts to win, you need to prove why there is enough of an active harm or enough of an active danger, and then explain why that weighs off against other opportunity costs. So things like, how does this weigh off against the protection or the sanctity of Okinawan citizens? Things like weighing off other actors who may have to opt into this without meaningfully getting harmed. So again, close round. That's all for the OA. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Ask you here or ask